Welcome to the Faster Podcast by FLO Cycling, the podcast where we talk about anything and everything that makes you faster on your bike. This is Season 1, Episode 9, and today we have sports psychology experts Dr. Simon Marshall and pro triathlete Lesley Paterson joining us on the show. Dr. Marshall and Lesley are the co-authors of The Brave Athlete, Calm the F Down and Rise to the Occasion, and owners of Brave Heart Coaching. Listen to this episode to learn how a healthy state of mind can help you become a faster cyclist. All right, Simon and Lesley, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining us. How are you doing today?
We're great. Yeah,
all good. Thank you so much for having us.
Awesome. And where are you guys joining us from?
San Diego. Beautiful San Diego. It's sunny. It's 75. Life is good.
Well, you know what? I'm your neighbor, so it's sunny and 75 where I am too.
Hey!
You know, it's funny. I feel like we kind of know each other without actually knowing each other. When I finished reading your book, the acknowledgement list was full of people that I know. Jess Sarah, Brian Sean Hill, the guys at Rehab United, and the person who connected us was Janae Shaw, a good friend of mine. We were at dinner. Yeah, and we were putting this podcast together, and I was like, I really want to get a sports psychologist on the show because it's such an interesting element of training and racing that we ignore a lot. And Janae's like, I know the perfect guy. And anyway, here you are. He's
not available, so Simon's around. I know Janae.
Exactly. So, guys, your book, The Brave Athlete, it's really, really well done. I'm a big audiobook fan, and you did an excellent job on the audiobook as well. The back and forth between Simon and Lesley from chapter to chapter was really done well. And, before reading the book, I thought that sports psychology was kind of about dealing with nerves before a race, maybe having some doubts about your performance and not being able to mentally push when you get to that pain stage in a race or training. And after reading the book, I realized that I was missing 90+% of what sports psychology covers. Right. Yeah. So for me, reading the book was really an eye-opening experience. And I'm really excited to talk to you guys about this on the show today because I think it's a very important topic, like I said, that doesn't get talked about enough. So your book goes into extreme levels of detail, which is great. But my general goal for this podcast is just to kind of cover the general concepts of as much as we can on the show. So without further ado, I think we should just jump right into the questions. And I want to talk about one of the central themes of the book, and it's the 3 different brains. And you guys talk frequently about the chimp brain, our professor brain, and our computer brain. So can you briefly describe each one of those brains and how they apply to sports psychology and what we'll learn in this podcast?
Yeah, I think, this isn't a new concept in psychology. I think different authors have put different metaphors to them. System 1 and system 2, or the elephant and the rider, or the lizard brain, and but I think that at its basic premise is that thinking about the brain functionally, so rather than sort of just purely anatomically about what different areas of the brain do, but thinking about it functionally, and we know that different parts of our brain have evolved at different times in our sort of history, and so over the last sort of 5-6 million years, we started off with what is essentially our primitive brain, what we call the chimp brain. In fact, we don't just call it that. We also borrowed that from someone called Dr. Steve Peters, who wrote a fantastic book called The Chimp Paradox. And it's the part of our brain that's really the limbic system, which is deep in the middle of our brain. It's been there for millions of years. And it's the emotional center. It's where all of our emotions come from. It's where all of our instincts and drives come from. It's where our pleasure centers are. And so it really is sort of a part of our brain that doesn't actually do any rational thinking. It just goes on feelings and impressions. And the job of feeling, and the job of emotion, or the reason we have emotions as humans, is to drive our decision making. So if we didn't have them, we probably wouldn't be very motivated to do anything. And so that part of our brain, we call it a chimp because it acts like a primitive primate. It kind of has tantrums occasionally. It doesn't really, it doesn't behave well in public sometimes. And it gives us all sorts of feelings that don't necessarily correspond to reality. And it's a bit like, the 2-year-old having a tantrum in the grocery store. Yep. Once they're set off, you're trying everything you can, bribing him or her to kind of calm down, giving it toys and trying to say, look, just don't make a scene. this isn't as catastrophic as you think it is. It's just a supermarket, But and our chimp brain does the same thing. And unfortunately, evolution has given it these really special powers to make sure that we listen to it. And the reason we have to listen to it is because its primary job in life is to keep us alive. So we don't really want to ignore it too often. If our lives are really in danger, that's where the fight or flight response comes from. That's the thing that's going to help us fight, run away, or hide, or do whatever it is as a survival. So our brain has to be wired to protect that instinct at all times. We can't be relied on to rationalize and analytically think our way out of life or death situations. And so one of the ancient powers it's been given is that it processes information from our ears and our eyes 5 times quicker than the rest of our brain. So before you know it, before you even had a chance to think about what's going on in the situation, your ears and all of our senses are picking up on what we call threat cues in your environment. And this is all happening at a subconscious level. So before you know it, a whole series of sort of hormonal responses and releases of certain neurotransmitters in the brain to get you ready to run, hide, fight, or so on. And there's not much we can do about that. And this is, people think about in the terms of like, some people think they have a sixth sense. They know something doesn't feel right, but they're not quite sure what it is. That's not a sixth sense at all. It's just the evidence that your limbic system is processing these sensory cues a lot quicker than you, right?
And so I'm not special?
Yeah, it's right. You're not special. Damn it. Can you believe it? But if you walk through an expo of a race the night before, or you go to a start line and you're not consciously looking at how lean and fit and tan everybody is, but your brain is subtly picking up on these cues. And the conclusion is that, holy crap, you're going to get an ass whooping tomorrow, right? Yeah. So it wants you to run. Now, our little wrinkly frontal cortex, the bit when you look at on the brain that you see, is the rational thinking you. That only deals in facts and logic. So that's really quite different than the emotional, catastrophic, paranoid limbic system chimp brain. And so, of course, your rational thinking brain is really the real you. So when you think about who you are, what you like in life, things, preferences, any problem solving, that's all happening in your frontal cortex. So, but the trouble is that you're up against an 800-pound gorilla, or in this case, a chimp, right? So when it feels threatened, there's often no amount of looking in a mirror and saying, come on, you can do this. It's only doesn't seem to work because it's processing information far quicker. And then the other sort of chemical evolutionary weapon it's got is that it throws a chemical brick at the rest of your brain. 30 neurotransmitters are released to make sure that your rational brain is even slower and lazier than it normally is, so you can't think your way out of problems. So these two brains are constantly in a fight, and whenever you have thoughts and feelings that you don't want, and you recognize that you're having them, it's always because your chimp brain has just hijacked your professor brain, and you're no longer in charge of your own brain. So the fundamental premise of our book, and the fundamental challenge of all sports psychology, and in fact not even sports psychology, life, right, is to say, I want to have fewer thoughts and feelings that I don't want. I want to enjoy this. I don't want to feel as though this is the most terrifying, humiliating, potentially embarrassing situation. It's just a race, or it's just a training session. It doesn't really matter in the big scheme of things. That sort of internal fight represents a battle between the chimp and the professor.
Yeah, that's awesome. And what about that computer brain?
Yeah, the computer brain is another sort of aspect that really focuses on, or is the place where all of our habits and routines and memories are stored. So this is whenever we're doing things without thinking too much about them, our automatic computer brain is in charge. This is the reason we can, hold a conversation while driving. It's because our automatic brain is ticking in. And most aerobic sports like swimming, cycling and running, and especially cycling, it's an automatic computer brain activity. You don't have to think, okay, which foot goes down next, or how do I steer? It's happening automatically. And so... But if you have memories of you rock up to a race and it started to rain and it's a crit, and the first thing you're thinking is, oh boy, I don't do well in the rain, or you're being fed experiences. Your computer brain which works at lightning speed, is feeding memories up to your chimp and your professor. Say, hey, this is the last time we're in this situation. What do you think? And of course, your chimp is the first to react because it's 5 times quicker than your professor. And before you know it, you're going down a rabbit hole of all the outcomes that are or reasons why it's not going to end up working out well for you, and hence you get nervous.
Nice. Cool. That's awesome. Okay. So now that we know that, we're set up for the rest of this podcast. Okay. So you talk about athletic self-identity in the book. What does that mean and what is it?
Well, athletic identity really represents like the thoughts and beliefs that we have about ourselves and our athleticism. So psychologists have a phrase or a word that describes kind of thoughts and feelings we have. It's called a schema, a self-schema. And a self-schema is simply it's almost like the architecture, the foundations of how your thoughts and feelings interact, determine how you consider yourself as an athlete. And this isn't just for an athlete, of course. You could substitute any identity, like your one as a husband or a wife or an employee, as a friend, as a mother or a father. We wear lots of hats in life. But each of those identities is made up of a belief system about what you can do, about your abilities, how other people see you, and as well as how that you explain success and failure in that sport, in those environments. So an athletic identity simply reflects the schema, the thoughts and the belief systems about your abilities as an athlete. And many people struggle with that, because if you've ever had discussions with athletes and they start off saying, "Oh, I'm just this, or I'm just a this, or I'm just slow, or I'm just." The just, we call it a case of the justers, is really a little window into their athletic identity, because one of the hallmarks of a strong or a mature identity is taking ownership of where you're at, right? So not sort of excusing it, or not self-aggrandizing, and not sort of boasting about it. It's like, this is where I'm at. This is what my ability is based on how much training I'm doing, and then, love it or lump it. So yeah, that's really what we mean by an athletic identity.
Nice. So these athletic self-identities, they can take several forms. Can you detail some of the identities and then explain how they can affect our performance?
Yeah, well, I suppose it's not so much taking forms. It reflects like identity problems that we run into. So one, for example, is when you chase a former identity. So in other words, if you've been really good as a junior or as a young adult, and then or even as an age group, middle-aged adult, and then you have some time away from the sport, and then you come back to it, and then all you do is that you're comparing yourself to how it used to be for you. So now the people that you used to be stronger than, they're beating you, and you get frustrated because your baseline is how you used to be, not how you are now. So we talk about chasing a former identity, and how do I keep staying motivated when I'm still comparing myself to, how I used to be? Another one is what we call a volatile athletic identity. And this is when your identity, the thoughts and beliefs that you have about your athleticism, like changes like, wheat flowing in the wind, right? So some days it's great, other times it's in the toilet. And why is that? So we try and understand, for example, one of our self-judgment systems, and we know it as self-worth. Like we call it almost like the roots of a tree, and they formed about your worth as a person, and these grow into a trunk of how your abilities as an athlete. But if they're exposed and they're a bit more influenced by external things around you, then you're more likely your beliefs about your fundamental abilities as an athlete are going to change based on the environments that you're in, whether you have success or failure in the here and now. They're not built on strong foundations. So what we try and do is understand if someone is struggling with what we think are athletic identity issues, how do we understand what the essence of the problem is, and then how do we go and fix it? So you have to ask those sorts of questions about their athletic history, whether they've, we try and look at their self-worth and self-esteem, and so on.
Huh. So once you do know what type of, athletic self-identity you have, what are things you do to improve the performance? If somebody has a volatile self-identity, or like, what do you do for them?
Yeah. Well, one of the things is like trying to, well, they vary based on, varied based on the issue at hand. But if you're sort of chasing a former identity, it's trying to get you to see yourself as like, this is the new you, right? This is your new baseline. And it's difficult because your chimp is desperate to compare yourself. Oh, you're no longer good at this. Why bother? You used to be this, and now you're getting beaten. And so you have to win that brain fight before you could even start to tackle the identity stuff.
One of the examples I would have said from my own career trajectory is I never had the confidence to call myself a professional athlete. And it took me sort of moving to California and sort of being around other people that kind of talk themselves up, because Californians are known for that, for me to sort of adopt that, because I just felt like I didn't deserve it, like I wasn't good enough. If I called myself a professional and yet I wasn't earning any money yet, all of those kind of inner chimp thoughts, then I didn't have a right to call myself that. And so what I did was I actually started to call myself that whenever I was in a conversation and someone would say, what do you do? I'm a professional athlete. So it's like taking that first step towards acknowledging, where it is you want to be and who it is you believe you can be. And it's almost like by saying it out loud enough, you start to believe in it. And you start to adopt all of the behaviors that come with being a professional athlete. Just because at the start I wasn't earning, enough money necessarily to say it was an income thing. I certainly had the dedication and was doing everything possible to become a professional athlete. So that's certainly one of the things that I dealt with personally.
Yeah. And the interesting thing is that your identity is independent of the objective level at which you're performing. So you can have a very strong athletic identity and really only been doing the sport of 1 or 2 years and are a beginner. You don't have to be a professional athlete. And this is always the difficult thing, because one of the elements of an athletic identity is how other people see you as well. So if you're a professional athlete, and this doesn't go for just athletes, call yourself a writer or whatever, the first thing they'll say, are you in the Olympics? And of course, that's how they're deciding whether how they calibrate. Or I'm a screenwriter. What have you seen? I've seen anything you've made in the movie theaters. Oh well, here we go. No. So we get bombarded with information that sort of always is sort of undermining that identity. So it's really trying to be comfortable and owning where you're at, because it's also about how serious you take it and what it means to you that determines it, not how fast you are or how many medals you've won or whether you're earning a living out of it.
Wow,
yeah, it's
crazy.
It's interesting you say that. I recently read this book on, it was actually on goal setting. And one of the things they said in it was, once you set a goal that you want to tell everybody that you have regular conversation with, that you have this goal. And so it's the concept of saying it out loud. It's almost like you have to live up to it. So I'm assuming that, if you're, Lesley, for yourself saying I'm a professional athlete, well, not only does it reinforce that in your own mind, but you kind of have to live up to that if you're saying that you're a professional athlete. Yeah.
Well, what's really interesting I've learned across the years is people have more respect for others who have a passion and a goal, and that they're willing to dedicate themselves to get there.
Exactly.
Whether or not it comes true or it doesn't. And so there's when you look around the world and you see plenty of people that are too scared to have that kind of goal or that kind of passion. And as a consequence, they don't go after it, because, if you put all your cards on the table and you say, this is what I want, and then it doesn't happen, you feel like you're a failure, and that everyone else is going to view you as a failure. But it's a very empowering thing to say, well, I don't care about any of that. What I care about is that, I'm super passionate about something and I'm going to go after it regardless.
Yeah. It's crazy too, that the spectrum that lives in, Simon, like you said, and Lesley, multiple time world champion and extremely talented athlete. And your side of it, you had a problem even saying you're a professional athlete. And then, like you say, here in California or in plenty of places in the world, you have this age group athlete who has no right saying that, but they're the best athlete in the city for sure. So it's like the size of your head really is very variable. And it kind of leads to our next question. You guys have a great quote in the book by Henry Ford, and it says, whether you think you can or you think you can't, you're right. And that leads into self-confidence and self-esteem and what you call self-efficacy. So can you explain those a little bit and how they apply to sports psychology?
Yeah, so all of these, there's lots of words about this concept of how you judge your own abilities that get thrown around in the sort of the sports world. This person lacks self-belief, or they're just overconfident, or they've just got low self-esteem. There's lots of self-words in there, and they are actually all related, but they are actually quite differentiated. They also don't mean the same thing. And so we give the analogy of a tree, and I spoke about this just earlier, is that your entire self-judgment system, how that you evaluate your own abilities, is based on sort of the depth of the tree. So the most fundamental way that we judge ourselves, we know it as self-worth. So self-worth are like the roots of the tree. They're under the soil. They've been formed since, a very early age. There are fundamental beliefs about our worth as a person, whether we are deserving of love, whether we are deserving of, equal rights and so on in the world, and so on. So these things are fairly immutable. They don't really change much once we grow up. And then above the roots support a trunk. And so this is what we consider to be self-esteem. So now self-esteem is above ground. And what that means is that it's more influenced by day-to-day living. So things that people say can influence how you feel about yourself. And your self-esteem is really these generalized statements about experience or abilities that you have based on your experiences. So this might be, well, I don't have much, low self-esteem about, my ability to be, to hold down a good relationship or to be an athlete or something like that, or even not as specific as that. And so if you find yourself, and because a trunk doesn't move that much in the wind, it's only the branches and leaves that move, this is still fairly robust to other things that happen with us. They still represent quite fundamental ways that we judge ourselves. But when you get into the branches, and this is the first time you have differentiated judgment. So in other words, I can have really high confidence in my ability as an athlete, but really low confidence in myself as a marketing professional, or whatever my career path is, or vice versa. Yeah. So now with self-confidence, these are much more sort of specific judgments about specific things that you can do. And of course, and multiple confidences live in the same head. I can be confident at one thing, but really unconfident about another. And then right at the end of these branches are leaves. And so psychologists talk about self-efficacy, because self-efficacy is a very task-specific form of confidence. So now, take the example of a bike racer. I can have self-confidence as a roadie, but really low self-efficacy to finish off a final sprint if it's down to a group of 5, right? And there's lots of reasons for that. But it represents a very task-specific form of it. And so when people come to us and say, can you speak to so-and-so? They just lack confidence. And it might be that they lack self-efficacy for just certain elements, because what that person needs is often varies by how deep in the trunks, in the tree system it goes. Someone who has low self-esteem, everything is going to be suffering because of it. It's very unusual to find someone who has low self-esteem, low self-worth, but really high self-efficacy and confidence. It just doesn't happen that way. So the first thing is we are interested in, when we think it's a self-judgment problem, is figuring out how deep in the tree the problem goes, because that determines whether you need sort of quite specific psychological, clinical psychological help or some psychotherapy, or can your coach, not even see a sports psychologist, can a coach help you deal with self-efficacy? Just get better at individual skills.
Yeah. Very cool. Very cool. Okay, you guys also talk a lot too about some athletes compare themselves to other athletes, and oftentimes what they're comparing themselves to is another particular athlete may be posting on their social media profile, which can be a dangerous place. So can you talk quickly about how comparing yourself to others can have a negative effect on your performance?
Oh, for sure. We call that impression management in terms of social media, and how people pose themselves on those social media platforms. It's ultimately the highlight reel of their lives, right? So it's not really true. The classic one I always remember is one of my best mates. She was having a tough time with her hubby, and of course, girls being girls, we talk about everything. And then, I went home and I saw this post on Facebook, and she was all smiling, happy with her hubby on Facebook, taking a picture at a restaurant. And everyone's like, "Oh, you guys are so happy! Oh my God, you're so lucky!" Just like that typifies everything. So I think it's suffice to say that what's out there and what's posted is not the reality of what's going on. But more importantly, I think, it's addictive, right? When you're on that social media, you almost are looking for that person, that perfect person that you really hate, and you're really sort of seeking it out in a way. But one thing that I really do is I will only go on social media if I'm in the right kind of mindset to be able to cope with that. And I'll forcibly not allow myself to go on it if I'm feeling at all doubtful, frustrated, maybe I've had a bad session, or I'm just not feeling that great or that confident. I won't go on it. So I think cycling your social media, not just jumping on it immediately, is really important. And then also, posting about your own vulnerabilities is a real key one. We know that we bond over weakness, not over strength. So one of the big things, we've done in the book, obviously, as well, but I've done personally through my sort of ups and downs of eating disorders and Lyme disease and injuries and self-doubt, is talk about it. Because I think if people that are further up the chain, so to speak, in terms of, I'm a professional athlete with world titles. If I talk about all of the ups and downs that I've gone through, then all of a sudden the athletes around me are like, oh my God, you deal with that? Oh, that makes me feel so much better. Oh, right. And all of a sudden you can kind of bond over that and overcome it. So, and then lastly, I think one of the biggest things I focus on a lot more, especially as I get older, is process goals. So instead of always thinking about the outcome of things, whether it's a training session, or a PR or a result or a podium, it's focusing on the craft of what it is that we do and really embracing and loving it and enjoying it. I mean, case in point, I've just been training the last 3 weeks with, I'm coaching kind of 3 or 4 pro males at the moment. And so I'm kind of out there both coaching them and sort of training with them and getting my ass absolutely handed to me. So, I'm having to suck it up and just be like, well, it doesn't matter, just focus on, all of those good elements, focus on my form, focus on, just getting the time in, all of those kinds of things. So I would say it's a myriad of ways to deal with that comparison.
But here's the real challenge of social media, and unfortunately, the impression management, which is, like Lesley said, is what psychologists use for the tricks and the games we play to manage other people's perception of us. That's what the human brain is wired to do this. It's not, if you fight against it, you're just fighting biology, right? And it'll kick and scream against you. So we'll do it naturally. And unfortunately, with social media now, it's become impression management software. That's what Facebook and Instagram is, because it's so easy to know where you sit in the pecking order, the social status, whether it's at speed or attractiveness or smarts or what have you. But of course, because people are responsible for their own image on social media, they curate it and it's not necessarily malicious and narcissistic. And there are some people who do it maliciously and narcissistically, but most of us just fail to. It's like selective disclosure, right? We show the parts that we want people to see, and we just, oh no, don't put that up because my ear sticks out that way, or you can see this part of my gut there, And so we present an image of ourselves of what we most want people to see, and then when they see it, they use that to determine where they sit in that pecking order. Yeah. And so the effect that has on you depends on how deep in the meat tree your problem lies. So if you've got low self-worth, your roots are exposed or they're kind of rotten to begin with, then you're going to take that stuff very, very personally, and it's going to be yet more evidence that you're worthless, that you're useless, and what's the point? But if you've got really high self-worth, self-esteem, self-confidence, you're going to say, hey, good for them. That's someone else. Oh, I look forward to having a challenge, head-to-head with that person, and, can't wait to duke it out. So how you interpret that information really is also related to your self-judgment.
That's interesting. If you look at most successful athletes, I mean, we just had the Olympics, and, you watch the Olympics and you see lean, muscular bodies in most athletic performance. In cycling and triathlon or any of these sports, you typically see the same thing. And in these sports, you got yourself displayed in tight lycra. So can you talk a little bit about some of the main body image issues we see in the sport and how those can affect the performance of an athlete?
Yeah, with any sport that either has an aesthetic component to it or a weight-dependent component to it, so you run the gamut from figure skating and gymnastics right through to mountain biking, road and triathlon. The weight matters and physical and body composition matters. That's the harsh reality of it. But there comes a point where, and again, there have been a few studies on this, that people with certain personality characteristics, the type A, the more high levels of anxiety, trait anxiety, neuroticism, they gravitate to endurance sport. So endurance sport doesn't turn you into that. It kind of is a way that is it's almost like an enabler of those traits. Right. And so it really becomes sort of a recipe for disaster in many senses. You've got people who are primed to go down the rabbit hole of obsessiveness about their preparation, whether it's dietary training or so on, or overdoing it, exercise dependency and that kind of stuff. And you've got a sport that actively rewards that. So then you start to get into problems. And this is why, in, say, the exercise dependency, it's a bit like exercise addiction, but we call it dependency. About in the general population, it has about a 3% prevalence rate. But in the elite sport world, it has about a 25% prevalence rate. In elite triathlon, they think it's probably closer to 50%. So it really does vary based on the kind of sport you're in, how it rewards leanness, shape, and weight.
I mean, for me personally, I lost 5 pounds of fat and ended up winning 3 world titles back to back. I mean, that's not a coincidence per se, but unfortunately, I tried to hold my leanness there, and it was particularly unhealthy, and I really messed up all my hormones and just kind of got myself in a pickle. So I think that, there's definitely a difference between male and female in terms of what's possible, in terms of, how we're holding our bodies. But you look at a lot of the women now, and let me tell you, most of those elite women now competing, they're incredibly lean, and most of them will not be menstruating. So we're rewarding unhealthy lifestyles, and that's the challenging part. It's not the case for all women, but certainly you look at any of those top runners, especially. I can't believe for a second that their hormones are healthy at that kind of leanness.
I think that moves into sort of the topic of eating disorders in the sport. So, you're saying that the sport sort of attracts obsessive personalities or addictive personalities. What are some of the most common eating disorders, and how prevalent do you actually think it is in the sport?
I think it's incredibly prevalent. I think I would rather call it disordered eating than eating disorders. That's the kind of spectrum, right? And I think most of my athletes that I coach all have disordered eating of some description.
Wow.
And certainly I would say probably close to about 95%, maybe even 100% of all women that I coach are all trying to lose weight, all of them. So that's the instant mindset, is that they are out to do this sport to lose weight. And so time and time again, I'll have them do a food diary for me. And albeit I'm not a nutritionist by training, but I have a lot of knowledge, and we work with top nutritionists ourselves. But I'll have a look at that. And generally, I mean, I've got some of these female athletes out there, maybe, they're doing 15 hours a week of training, a solid amount. And they're having like 1,500 calories a day, and they're just messing up their systems.
Wow.
But they constantly restrict, and it gets them into a whole mess of trouble. And then other stuff starts to happen. You hold on to that weight, your hormones go all over the place, you have gut issues, on and on and on. So, it's trying to see the sport, what is it that you love about the sport, the other things, not just how does my body look, but how does it feel to move through space? What are, the social aspects of what it is that I do, like all of the real things that drive the passion towards that sport, and focusing on feeling good in doing that. And often when we're calorie restricting, you're not feeling good. So that's certainly one of the big things that I do. And again, I mean, there's certainly plenty of men that are the same, but it just feels like there's this constant train of, or this constant sort of horizon seeking for, I want to be leaner, I want to be thinner, all the time.
Wow.
In fact, when you ask athletes, you say, what's your, the proverbial fighting weight? What's your ideal racing weight? And they'll give you a weight. They'll know it to the pound. And then you say, okay, what weight are you now? And those two numbers are never the same. Never, right? Now, you could ask a Tour de France rider a week before the Tour, and that number will not be the same.
Wow.
It's very rare that people are ever content with what they think their ideal race weight is. And they can do it sort of, retrospectively, but they can't do it in the here and now and projecting forward. So it tells you that there's an inherent dissatisfaction with where we are now and where we want to be, where we think we need to be. And that's a problem, because that encourages the preclinical eating disorder, which is disordered eating. That encourages a whole host of behaviors that try to help you manage your body shape, your muscle mass, your fat mass, and your diet and your food intake. accordingly.
So
Yeah,
do
that's
you
crazy.
work on getting athletes to accept their current weight versus try and hit some, target training weight?
Yeah, I mean, you need to kind of base that on one of the biggest carrots you have for athletes is performance. So if you've got performance data based on a link to their body weights, that you were at your best when you were racing at 67, 64 kilos or whatever, right? You're trying to hold 60 kilos, but we know, and it might not be, a one-off performance, but your immune function, your responsiveness, your repeatability, the things that help you endure and be consistent as an athlete, you're better at a certain way. So if you can tag it to objective performance data, that's going to be better.
Yeah.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah, that's crazy. I'm fortunate. I've never had issues with weight. I'm just naturally always very lean, and it goes back to my original point I made at the beginning of this. There's so many aspects of sports psychology that people just don't realize because maybe they themselves don't deal with it, and it's kind of interesting. Just a quick follow-up question to that before we get into. I want to talk about injury, but before we get into injury, how responsible are some of the international sport associations for some of these disordered eatings? I won't name the country, but I know a pro athlete who, pro athlete who, the guy's, I'm 5'11", 6 feet tall. My buddy's the same size. He raced for this country, and I mean, he was eating essentially lettuce. Training 6 hours a day, 100 and I think we had him down to like 28 pounds or something when we did the conversion. Jeez. And it's just that he was still too heavy. Yeah. So where's the responsibility and where does what makes sense? How does that happen? You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Well, they run it as a business, right? A lot of these international sort of funding entities and whatnot, they're given money by the government or other resources, and they're allocated, each sport is allocated a certain amount of money. So everyone's job is on the line to make sure that they get that gold medal at the Olympics or whatever their, sort of metric is for performance. And they don't give a shit about what it takes to get there, right? It's the whole throwing the eggs against the wall type deal. And there's many coaches that continue to do that. It's not, hey, this is the person and this is what they can do and how do we best find something that's right for them. It's, this is what we need to achieve and we're just going to throw everything at it the best that we can. So, and I also think as well, there's a lot of coaches that are, we move towards the big, sports science base. And so there's a lot of coaches out there that don't have the language, the way of communicating with athletes, and they separate it. Oh, you need a sports psychologist. Go sit in this room and talk to this person. They don't integrate it into this sort of minute by minute and everyday coaching. And that's where it can be problematic. Because I think as soon as you say, hey, you need a sports psychologist, the automatic reaction is, oh, wow, I've got something wrong with me. Instead of integrating it all and saying, how can we maximize your potential, both in your brain and in your body? And not many coaches are trained in that. And I know that's Simon's constant frustration, having been in the field for a long time.
Yeah. Crazy. Okay, let's get into injury. This is something that I personally have dealt with a lot. And man, you go through your ups and downs with it. You get really, really fit and you feel like you're on top of the world and you get injured. And then you're kind of back to square one. You lose a ton of fitness. And there seems to be, like you said in the book, there's different types of athletes, and some let injury defeat them. Some hide from the reality of their injuries. Some obsess over their injuries, and some athletes just figure out how to get better and get back. So can you talk a little bit about these different types of athletes and what people can do to better address being injured?
Yeah, I mean, I've got a lot of experience with injuries. So, like, as in, hundreds almost. So, I've had to find my own way of being able to deal with it without things just completely falling apart. And I think it's like anything in life. When something doesn't go right, you can choose to use it as an opportunity to learn and grow, or you can choose to let it, just kind of drill you into the ground. But I think in any instance, I think injury is something that you have to understand that you're going to go through the stages of grief. when you do get it. And that sounds all very sort of intense and what have you, when you figure, stages of grief, someone's actually died,
Right.
but it has a huge impact on your life, right? You have a lot invested in your sport, a lot of people, a lot of, your identity is wrapped up in that. And so it's what you think about, a lot. It's a huge part of your social network, all of these things. So when it goes belly up, you're kind of left swimming around thinking, well, what now?
Yeah.
So, for me personally, it's been about getting to that place of acceptance, and building what I call my health hustle, my investigative health hustle. And basically what that is about is really trying to understand why this injury occurred. Now, it might be different if, hey, you've fallen off the mountain bike and you've broken something and it's pretty straight down the line as to why it happened. But even then, you could be looking at your bike skills and why did that happen?
Right.
Were you too tired going into a certain type of workout? It's always good to be reflective, but certainly if it's an overuse injury, really getting to the nitty gritty of why it happened. Because how many athletes do I know that come to me and they're like, oh, I pulled my calf, so I went and had a massage. Well, we don't actually know that having a massage on a pulled calf is the right thing to do. Yeah. But first and foremost, why did it happen?
Right.
So, having some kind of biomechanical assessment, figuring out, was there some kind of feet issues, is there some kind of hip issues, hip tightness, quad tightness that's causing you to overuse your calves, on and on and on. So really getting down to the nitty-gritty of why it happens so that when we do get back to the sport that we love, it's not going to happen again. Yeah. And then it's about treating the symptoms and saying, okay, let's look out there and see all that's available to me given my, finances, given my situation. And I mean, I've probably had every therapy under the sun. I've had stem cell therapy, PRP, flipping ART, acupuncture, voodoo, hoodoo, dancing around, flipping balls. I mean, I've done everything.
Yeah. Lesley, I think this is another area where we're very similar, but we just don't know it. I've probably had 15 or 20 MRIs in the last 5-10 years. I've seen every PT in the country. I've tried everything from a guy waving a book over me and telling me I need to eat more butter. And I thought it's crazy.
Oh, totally.
And it's this maddening process because for me, I still really don't know why I have these chronic injuries, but it hit home, that part of the book. And it was just, it's interesting that you seem to have a very similar history with it. So that's probably why we both know the Hill brothers.
Well, big time. Well, I think the very nature of, of what it is that we do, right? We push to the edge. And if you're always pushing to the edge, then chances are you're going to get injured because you need to know how tight to screw that top,
Yep.
That bolt before it breaks. And so if you're in that kind of personality, then chances are you're going to suffer more injuries for one. But then also it means that you are going to have more of a health hustle. You're going to really get to the bottom of it. But I think it's really helped me help other people by learning all of this stuff.
Yep.
And then not only that, it's given me this wonderful base that when I do get back to training and I am injured, I'm able to really critically think about what it is that I'm doing and why I'm doing it. And too many athletes out there just kind of, they go about their business and they just kind of clock miles and they don't have any self-reflective ability going on. And then I think the big thing is, how do we stop from falling into that precipice of depression? All of your mates are doing that race that you were supposed to do and now you can't do it because you're injured. What do you do in that instance? And for me personally, I'll generally pull back from that social environment, so I'm not getting my nose shoved in it all the time. I still keep in touch with all my close friends because they're close friends regardless of the sport or not. And then I put my energies into other passions that fulfill me in other ways. I have a film career, I'm a script writer, love to go to the movies, like lots of other things that are going to, really sort of nourish my soul in other ways. And then I'm going to figure out what it is that I can do. And I'm just going to exhaust the shit out of myself by doing that.
Awesome.
So that I'm too tired to be bothered about the fact that I cannot run.
Yeah.
So for me, it's, maybe getting on the Stairmaster or something like that, where I'm simulating some running action and still building some good posterior chain engagement for running when I get back to it, and I'm still getting a workout. So there's many different ways to sort of find a positive.
Yeah. Okay. Very cool.
But when your athletic identity has developed at the sort of expense of other identities, in other words, you'll kind of become one-dimensional as a person, right? And this is especially true of pro athletes, just because their job dictates that their athletic identity is first and foremost. When something happens to that, it's just like an investment portfolio. When that stock tanks, then you've got a whole host of other problems, because everything that you thought and evaluated yourself about what's important and how successful you are, whatever, it gets undermined. And so we often say that a great way to protect against being very vulnerable to sort of quite severe emotional reactions to injury is to make sure you have other aspects of your life that are developed. And there's really no excuse for doing that. You could be a pro triathlete, some of the most obsessive athletes in the world who are training 40, 45 hours a week. You can still have other things in your life. And unfortunately, the sports system, it rarely encourages that, because you need to eat, sleep, and train.
Okay, right.
So having those other aspects is really important. And then the second part is that when you do feel you have a negative sort of emotional reaction, you're frustrated, you're angry, it's okay. That's quite normal. It's a sign that it matters to you, that it's important. But where we draw the line, in fact, we even encourage it, we call it the mourning period or the pissy period. There you say, listen, let yourself wallow in it. But at this date, you make a decision to move on. And so it's really important you give yourself a quit date for mourning about it or moping around about it, because if you don't, your partner will.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Talking about that, and this kind of leads into the next question. You guys are really good at helping us lead into the questions that we have here, but we talked about this a bit earlier in the show. You mentioned the word exercise dependence, and that's really when athletes have an unhealthy relationship with exercise. So what are some signs that would suggest an athlete is dependent on exercise?
Yeah, so we've borrowed, the research on this has really borrowed from the sort of mainstream addiction literature. So they've tried to look at, are there commonalities between a substance addiction and sort of exercise addiction, for want of a better word? And there are some real challenges, right, to comparing the two, because we know that exercise fundamentally is good for you, whereas substance abuse isn't. So there's a certain amount of of dosage that's obviously going to be helpful for you. But we do know that there are some criteria that we use to define it. And one of them, for example, is withdrawal symptoms, right? Do you feel grouchy? Do you feel as though you're kind of off kilter a little bit emotionally when the exercise is withdrawn from you? You either have an injury or you have a taper, a race, we call it the taper tantrums. In the week leading up to an exercise, when you've cut your training volume by 50% and you find yourself, rather than feeling energized, enthusiastic and confident, you find yourself feeling heavy-legged, sort of frustrated, mopey, because you're withdrawing quite an important biological mechanism in your brain that's been rewarding that exercise, these dopamine and all the other endorphins and all the other transmitters. And another criteria is tolerance. And tolerance is simply, I need more and more of it to get the same fix, right? So this doesn't really mean that you kind of, because, one of the challenges in exercise is the overload principle. I need to do more to get fitter. If I keep doing the same thing, I'll become a bit stagnant or I'll stabilize. So what we really mean here is, people who really have a tendency to go harder than they've really ever planned to, right? Everything, we all know those riders who every session, it's going to be hard. They kind of ride at that sort of level. And it's really hard to sort of get away from that. So if you find yourself needing more and more of it to get the same feeling, then that's usually a problem. Another criteria is called intention effect. So do you always go out or train for longer than you'd planned to? And we all know those riders, they meet for a 2-hour ride and it's always going to be 2.5 to 3 hours. It's never 2 hours. Or the people who we do 150, let's just keep going around the block until we get our 2 hours in, right? So is there an intention always to do more than you actually have planned to? And it's hard to be around that as well, right? Because if you're around those people all the time, you kind of know them, you can see them, they kind of stand out, some of those feelings.
Nice, yeah. Let's talk about pre-race nerves, anxiety, and certain things like that. How can athletes manage that? I mean, it's important. You get an important race, you put a lot of time in. I think it's normal to be anxious or nervous. So, it's kind of a human response, but what's some of our best ways to deal with that?
Yeah, so the nerves and anxiety, again, this comes back to the chimp and the professor brain fight in combination with the computer brain feeding you information about what the likely outcome is going to be based on your prior history or so on. So your nerves and anxiety, the fight or flight response, all of the physical changes, the physical anxiety, the sweaty palms, the nauseousness, the sort of the heavy leg feeling and that kind of stuff, all those reactions, physiological reactions, are actually designed to make you quicker, not slower. So the first thing that we try and get athletes to do is to reframe the physical sensations of anxiety as readiness. So in other words, the needing to go to the loo 5 times before a race start is not a sign that you should be worried about. It's great. It's your body's way of saying, my watts per kilo is going up every time I go into that toilet, so keep it coming, right? So every chance we get to try and understand, to make ourselves as light as possible, our grip as much as possible. That's why we get sweaty palms and so on. We are hyperventilating. We're trying to hyperoxygenate in response to a threat so we can get away quicker. So the physical symptoms are not usually something to worry about. And once we actually get going in the race or the training session that we're nervous about, those things often disappear. And we're lucky because endurance sport, physical anxiety rarely affects performance. It does in fine motor skill sports. If you're a target shooter or a golfer, when tiny changes in muscle tension are going to fundamentally affect the biomechanics of the action. But in gross motor sports, running, cycling, swimming, it doesn't actually matter that much. So by all means, feel as nervous as you want, but mostly it will disappear. Okay. What most athletes struggle with the most is the mental anxiety, the worry and the self-doubt and the fear. And this is all chimp stuff, right? And our chimp, like I said, is motivated by wanting you to stay alive. That's a noble cause. But the 3 things that your chimp brain is most concerned about and will literally crap the bed if it thinks it's going to happen is that there's a chance for you to be humiliated, embarrassed, or shown to be inadequate, right? Those 3 things. And so what we often do, your chimp doesn't know that it's just a bike race or it's just a 5K or whatever a big chain gang ride that you've been scared of that you've now finally got the guts to go to. Your chimp brain doesn't know that it's just it thinks that your life and your reputation is on the line. And so one of the things that we have to do is to try and put it all in perspective. And we get people to fail. In fact, you want people to fail because you see that the world still turns and you don't actually get ridiculed. And people are far too self-absorbed in their own performance to worry about the fact that you got dropped 15 laps in of a 40-lap race, right? So most of the time we're worried about things that are purely fictitious. We've invented them in our head, the scenarios and the catastrophic outcomes that are a consequence of it. So we try and win that brain fight by using a couple of strategies with our chimp. And one of those we call a chimp purge. It's that you say out loud or you write it down just before the event, all of the things that your chimp is worried about. And you don't try and interject, you don't try and interrupt it or explain it away. You just let it rant at you. And this might seem like the worst self-talk you've ever given yourself in the world, but the reason it works is that you have to do it until your chimp runs dry of things to say. You start repeating yourself, you run out of things that you're scared about or worried about, and it usually, for most people, takes about 3 to 4 minutes. For some people, it can take 10 minutes, but you keep going until you're hearing no new sort of stuff thrown at you. And wow. And what that does is it sort of reduces, once you do that, sort of blood flow to the limbic system to the chimp reduces and drops. And it might be simply because the threat doesn't materialize when you don't try and interrupt it. So it kind of, the chimp goes back in its cage and goes to sleep or so on. So that alone can really help you feel a bit lighter, you feel a bit taller as a consequence of doing that. You have to do it until it's exhausted. Okay. The other strategy is to now use some professor brain like Jedi tools of facts and logic and say, well, okay, you're worried, chimp brain, about getting dropped and looking embarrassed in front of this new team that you're on. And so let's talk about, okay, what's the likelihood of that happening? And in some instances, it might be highly likely. Listen, no amount of your chimp brain can smell a rat a mile away. No amount of I'm going to get dropped because I've been dropped every single race in the last 2 seasons is going to, will be replaced by saying I'm going to get a break off the front and solo it to the finish No chimp brain is going to believe that. But you can say, okay, if this situation does materialize, so what? What is going to happen? Let's talk through the scenarios. And so you're trying to confront the irrational, illogical, catastrophizing and awfulizing and all the other isings that psychologists like to use that what your chimp is worried about. And you actually find that rarely do those things come true, if ever. Okay. And it's really just figments of your own imagination. And the best way to overcome that is to force yourself to be in those situations where that happens. So you can see first and foremost that, the worst case scenario happened. And guess what? I'm still alive and no one actually cared that much other than me.
Crazy. That's crazy. Okay, so I have two more questions for you. I want to be respectful of your time today. So of the last two, the first one is we have these terms, redlining, the hurt locker, being in the pain cave, and they're all expressions to describe that painful state we enter when training or racing. So how do athletes, you hear about the central governor theory by Tim Noakes. Yeah. So which is a theory that, it's just your body telling you to go easier when you really don't have to. So how do athletes learn to, for lack of better terms, embrace the suck and perform better?
Yeah. Well, so there's a couple of things. One is the central governor theory, the notion that your brain plays a critical role in sending you signals to determine how much left you've got in the tank. And it all isn't related to muscle glycogen and, cardiovascular and respiratory factors and so on. And that is still a contentious theory. We don't yet really know to what extent one theory is more established over another. Well, we know that the central governor theory is the less established, but we think that it's not contentious to say, listen, the brain probably plays quite an important role in determining how much that you can endure this. And this, all athletes know it, because some days you can ride at the exact same wattage and it feels very different. Some days you can tough it up, suck it up. Other days you just feel really wimpy and you want to go home, and nothing else seems to be different. So your brain does play a key role, but we do know that we can be nice to our brain and when it's faced with discomfort and pain. And one thing, the one way that we can be nice to it is never to think about the entirety of the challenge ahead. We break it up into small, manageable chunks. So this technique is called segmenting. So in other words, if you've got to ride 100 miles and you're thinking, I've not, it might be a sportif or something, and you're thinking, can I do a century? I haven't really done one before. Well, the first thing is to don't think of it like that. Think of it as 4 25-mile rides, and you only think about the second 25 after you've done the first 25. So the more you can split up a task into small, manageable chunks, your brain is going to thank you, and it will thank you by giving you a little squirt of dopamine once you've been able to check something off the list, right? So dopamine is we know it's the sort of the pleasure reward neurotransmitter in our brain that gives us that sensation of of doing well and reward. But we also know that it drives motivation. It's like if you could pinpoint what a biological drive or cause of motivation, it would probably be dopamine, or the research suggests it's probably related to the dopaminergic system. So what this means is that when you set yourself a goal, not only do you kind of mentally get to check it off the list, that's done, squirt, reward, feel good, but it also drives the wanting or needing to continue. So this is why when athletes say, I don't think I can do that. I've got a 2-hour ride scheduled and it's raining. I don't think I can do that. Well, why don't we do we call the quarter quit rule. So commit to doing 25% of it. And after 25%, make a decision whether you want to turn around and come home. Totally fine if you want to come around and turn home. But let's get a quarter done. And guess what happens? You get that quarter done. Well, I'm a quarter of the way through. I'll just go another little bit more. You get, I'm halfway now. And you're on this sort of dopamine snowball, right? And so your brain really likes it when you do that. So be kind to it. Don't think about everything it has to accomplish. The same, no more true is this of the race of truth, right? In time trialing, when you're left alone with your own thoughts, if you think about 40K, I've still got 36 of these to go and I'm feeling like this now, no wonder your brain is trying to tell you, your chimp is screaming at you, what are you doing? Why? Or the psychology of the thoughts of escape. Oh, please, please let me have a flat tire, please. Put me out of my misery. So break it up one lap at a time. So segmenting is absolutely one of the first lines of defense.
Wow, that's awesome info.
All the time. Yeah. It works so well.
So our last question, and this is a question that we ask everybody on the show, and we call it our Watt Point question. And basically, the premise behind the question is, if you listen to this podcast episode, how many watts is the advice worth? So we always do it based on an athlete that has a 300 watt FTP, just as a random thing. But you take an athlete who is mentally in a psychologically good place on race day, and they can hold their target 300 watts. How much of an effect can your psychological state have on your performance? And we usually get it in a range of watts. What would that be, do you think?
Yeah, well, it's 17.2 watts. I know. I can't kind of question that. It's like, what's the meaning of life? It's 42. I think.
Right. And I know in your expertise, this is a hard one, but I'm assuming it's a large effect that this can have.
It is. I would have said it's a good 15% gain.
Okay.
Yeah, 15 to 20%. I mean, because what it might teach you is, how do you push beyond the data? How do you push beyond the boundaries? Can you really be self-reflective? Can you look inside yourself and see where the limiters are? Do you need a different coach? Have you considered other methodologies? Are you analyzing yourself enough to really question your deepest, darkest fears?
Yep.
And that's where the gains are going to come. It's not maybe necessarily, hey, read this book and you get a 20% at your next race. It's read this book and how does this set you up for the next however many years, not just to excel in your sport, but to excel as a person.
Right. That's a really good answer.
I think I would frame that in the context of, well, listen, we don't know how to put it precise, but we know that it's worth something. And so when you look at your training, if you know it's worth something, how much of your training do you devote to something that's worth something, right? And most riders will say, I really don't work on my mental training at all, yet I know it's worth something. That discrepancy alone tells you that you're sort of leaving stuff on the table.
Awesome. Okay, guys, I can't thank you enough for being on the show. Like I said, this is a very important topic that I think doesn't get enough attention. So thank you for helping us shed some light on this. I have to say that your amazing accents make everything you say sound so much more official. So thanks for that. And for the listeners and athletes who are hearing this, where can they get their hands on your book, and where can they learn more about your coaching business, Braveheart Coaching?
Totally. They can go to our website, braveheartcoach.com. On there, they can either order the book or go to Amazon and get, the Audible version or the hard copy version. And then certainly on our website, we have what's called a SMOG test, where athletes can get on there and fill out a questionnaire, and I'll call you up, no strings attached, and chat about your training and see what's going well and what's not going well. And, we take it from there. If you are interested in coaching, great. If you're not, you're not. And hopefully you've learned something, or at least enjoyed hearing my accent for 10 minutes.
Awesome. And let's assume that we have somebody that is listening to this podcast episode, and maybe themselves, or they have a loved one that they potentially believe maybe is addicted to racing or has an eating disorder, and they want to try and get somebody some help for themselves or for a loved one. What recommendations can you give for somebody in that situation?
Well, I think the first thing is, to speak, we know that empathy, not sympathy, is the key, right? So empathy is trying to understand, walk in their shoes about what it must feel like. And like with exercise and food disorders, it's not about the exercise and it's not about the food. It's usually about some aspect of anxiety, control, and those other things. So talk about those feelings rather than you're doing too much, you need to stop, you need to eat more and eat less, or so on. So talk about what it must feel like. And so in terms of getting help, if you think you need specialized help, this is obviously quite specific to where you are. There are lots of in-person sports psychologists and clinical psychologists. So you can just Google exercise dependency or eating disorder. You can reach out to me as well. I work with a lot of athletes who have some of these issues. So there's lots of great resources online now, helplines as well to help this. There's lots of resources, but just go on, do some foraging and learning of yourself about how best to help them.
Awesome. Guys, thank you so much again for being on the show. Go enjoy that 75-degree weather, because I'm about to do the same thing. And awesome. Thanks you so much. Have a great day.
Thanks, boys. Cheers. Bye.
Cheers. Later. Thank you for listening to this episode. Be sure to listen to episode 10, where we interview Dr. Jessica Nurek to learn how studying your genetics can help you become a faster cyclist. If you enjoyed the show, please help us by sharing our podcast and by leaving a rating or review. If you want to learn more about our company, FLO Cycling, please visit us online at flocycling.com. That's F as in Frank, LOCYCLING.com. You can also find us under FLO Cycling on Facebook and Instagram. Until next time, ride safe.